Hey everyone, welcome back to the Pre-Calculus 20 videos. In this video, we're going to look at Lesson 3 from Chapter 7, which is looking at absolute value equations. In the first video, we looked at solving absolute value equations by graphing, and in this video, we're going to look at solving these types of equations using algebra. So here we're going to look at the second example from your set of notes, and here we're going to be looking at solving the absolute value of x minus 10 is equal to x squared minus 10x. So in order to solve using algebra, our first step is that we need to write this equation as a piecewise function. So what we do is we take the specific absolute value, and we're going to write this as a piecewise function. So to write this as a piecewise function, you're going to write y is equal to, and then you need a large fancy bracket, and you're first going to write your first whatever's inside your absolute value brackets here. So you write that x minus 10. And then below it, you're going to write the negative value. So you put negative x minus 10. So you essentially just put this function in brackets and put a negative symbol out front. So what happens here is that here is the regular function without the absolute value brackets. And here we would take the opposite value. So here is where the absolute value does absolutely nothing. So if you guys remembered on our graph, there was parts of our graph that didn't change. That would apply to this section of our piecewise function. And then where we had to take the opposite value, or reflected about that x-axis, would be this little function here. So to determine where we had a regular function, that was where, starting from your x-intercept and going either in the left or right direction, that there is where we had or didn't need to apply that absolute value. So what you could do is, if this was super complicated, you could put this into an equation, set it equal to 0, and solve for x. Although in this case here, if you just look at this, x minus 10, so if we put 10 in for x, that would give us 0. So we would say if x was greater than or equal to 10. So any number bigger than or equal to 10 would make this a positive value, meaning we wouldn't have to use that absolute value symbol. So anything less than that, you would have to take the opposite value, or you can even multiply it by -1, and then you get that positive value. So you would say basically x is anything less than 10. And this here is our piecewise function. So essentially what you've done is you've broken it down into pieces. The first piece is where we don't need to apply an absolute value, and then the second one is where we have to apply the absolute value, so to make it positive. So then what we do is we're going to take our first function, so that one where we do not need that absolute value, and we're going to set that equal to x squared minus 10x. So we're actually going to have two equations here that we have to solve for. So here we have x minus 10 is equal to anything that was on the right-hand side here. So x squared minus 10x. And then we're just going to solve for x. So what we can do is start by moving everything to one side. So I'm going to subtract I'm going to subtract x and add 10 to each side. And that would give us 0 is equal to x squared, and then negative 10x minus x is negative 11x, then nothing plus 10 is positive 10. So here we have a trinomial, so there's three terms, which means we can either use factoring or the quadratic formula. And when we can, we should always use factoring because it'll be a little bit quicker. So here we're going to be looking at that product and sum. In this case here, we can use that shortcut method I showed you a few videos ago, where we don't have that a value, or our a value here is 1, so we can use a shortcut. So your product is the first times last term, which is 10. Then the sum is negative 11, so it's that middle value there. So you want to think of two values that multiply to 10, but have a sum of negative 11. And in that case here, those two numbers are negative 10 and negative 1. So they multiply together to be positive 10, but add together to be negative 11. Then what we do is we're going to take two brackets, set it equal to 0. I'm going to keep it equivalent to what we had in the beginning. So here are the zeros on the left side. So my variable goes on the left side. So we have x and x. And then our first number is going to fill in our first bracket, so x minus 10, and same thing with our second value, so it'll be x minus 1. So then we'll set each of those factors equal to 0 and solve for x. So here to solve for x in our first factor, we have x subtract 10. So to get rid of subtract 10, I'm going to add 10. And that would give us 10 is equal to x. And do the same thing for our second factor. So here I want to add 1 to get rid of that. So I have x is equal to 1. So whenever you have your solutions, so we're just going to take a break from before we do our second piecewise function. We first want to make sure that these answers actually fit our solutions. So I'm just going to scroll up here. So in our piecewise function, we said to use the first equation, x has to be greater than or equal to 10. So just go back and double check that these actually work. So here, x is equal to 10, which that's fine. So this here is a solution. But this one here is less than 10, which means that this is not a solution. So that's called an extraneous root. So that did not meet our restrictions. X had to be either equal to or greater than. So if it was less than, then this solution does not count. So when you've done that, then we can go back up here and work with the second part of our piecewise function. We're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to set this function equal to x squared minus 10x and solve. And so my first step here is I'm going to apply this negative. So I'm going to use my distributing property, or what I call shooting your arrows. So you have negative times x is negative x, and negative times negative 10 is positive 10. Then once again, I want to move everything all to one side. So here I want to add x and subtract 10. So on my left-hand side here, I get 0 is equal to, so you have x squared, and negative 10x plus x is that's negative 9x. And then subtract 10. So here we have a trinomial, which means we can use factoring to solve. So we'll look at the product and sum method. So our product here is 1 times negative 10, which would be negative 10, and our sum is that middle value, which is negative 9. So think of two numbers that multiply to negative 10, but have a sum of negative 9. And those two numbers are negative 10 and positive 1. So once again, I'm going to write 0 is equal to, I'm going to draw two sets of brackets. My variable goes on the left-hand side here, so that's x and x. And then these numbers will fill in the two brackets. So we have x minus 10. This here is a positive 1, so we're going to write plus 1. Then we're going to set each of those factors equal to 0. And then we're going to solve. So here I want to get rid of subtract 10, so I'm going to add 10 to each side. So say that x is equal to positive 10. And here I want to subtract 1 to move it to the other side. So here x would be equal to negative 1. So once again, now we want to make sure that we go back up to our restrictions and just check to make sure that our answers actually work. So here our restrictions were x has to be less than 10. So here we have x is equal to 10, but that's not what our restriction said. So x cannot be equal to 10, which makes this an extraneous root. And then we have x is equal to negative 1. Well, that's less than 10, so this one here is fine. So now that we have our answers, we'd have x is equal to 10 and x is equal to -1. So I'm just going to write this as a overall summary sentence. So in our first piece of the piecewise function, we have x is equal to 10, and then we have x is equal to -1 in the second part. And now we have to go and verify our answers. So that just means that we have to plug in our x value into the original equation. So I'm first going to work with x is equal to 10. So we have the absolute value of x minus 10. So we'll have 10 minus 10 is equal to x squared. So we have 10 squared minus 10 times x, which is 10. So then we could just solve our left side, solve our right side, and show that they are equal to each other. So 10 minus 10 here is 0. So that's absolute value of 0 is equal to, so 10 squared is 100 minus 10 times 10, which is 100. Then the absolute value of 0 is just 0, and 100 minus 100 is 0. So that actually works for our equation. So x is equal to 10 is a solution. Then let's go and check x is equal to -1. So we have the absolute value of -1 minus 10 is equal to -1 squared minus 10 times -1. So -1 minus 10 is -11. And sorry, that should be an absolute value, not a bracket. That's equal to, so -1 squared is +1, and -10 times -1 is +10. So the absolute value of -11 is +10, is +11, and then 1 plus 10 is +11. So 11 is equal to 11, which means that verifies. So both x is equal to 10 and x is equal to -1 are solutions to this equation. So that is everything here for this video. So if you guys have any questions, make sure to come see me in class or text me on Remind 101. And thank you guys so much for watching.